Hello, our group will be talking about fisheries with focusing on the endangered and threatened species in the Great Lakes region. Before talking specifically about the Great Lakes region, here's some background on fisheries in general. There are three main components of fisheries: commercial, which is catching and marketing for a profit; recreational, which is fishing for pleasure; and subsistence, which is family or community fishing. Because fish is an open access resource, meaning anyone has access to it, but it is competitive, there can be many problems if not regulated. So, fisheries were created as a way to protect and sustain fish and other marine populations. A lot of the problems fisheries face include overfishing, pollution, habitat degradation, climate change, invasive species, and creating sustainable fisheries is also a challenge. Fisheries are managed by state laws and regulations, and if the state is along the coast, they manage up to 3 miles from the coastline. Beyond that, the U.S. government regulates that area, up to 200 miles from the coastline. The marine fisheries are regulated by NOAA, and the Great Lakes fisheries specifically are regulated by the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, which includes the United States and Canada. Each state's DNR also regulates the fisheries within their state borders. These will all be discussed in greater detail later in the presentation. Here's some more overall information about marine fisheries and what exactly the fish and species caught are being used for, and the top species being produced in the commercial industry. The first image on the right highlights the percentage of what the catch was being used for in 2018. As you can see, 92% of the products were in the edible category and were mostly in frozen form, with fresh being the second highest type. It also shows that Alaska pollock was the top species processed, with 1.4 billion pounds caught, which is valued at $1.98 billion. The total value of the products produced is about $12 billion. The image on the right shows data from 2018 showing just how big of an industry this is in the United States. It shows 4 regions, which are the Pacific, Alaska, Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic. Alaska had the highest percentage of landings, but the Atlantic region had the highest value percentage. More specifically, in the Great Lakes region, there are currently around 139 native species and 34 invasive species that are supported by the Great Lakes. As a result of all the problems mentioned earlier, there are around 18 native species that have been extirpated from at least one of the Great Lakes. As of today, 61 species in the Great Lakes are considered endangered or threatened. Lake whitefish and walleye are 2 of the main fish species that are the foundation of the commercial aspect of fisheries in the Great Lakes region. And salmon, walleye, and trout are some of the main species in the recreational category. The Great Lakes commercial, recreational, and tribal fisheries are collectively valued at more than $7 billion annually and support more than 75,000 jobs.
There are many government and independent agencies which manage the fisheries throughout the United States. NOAA, or National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, are under the Department of Commerce. NOAA has 474 stocks under 46 fishery management plans. NOAA also manages all marine mammals under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. NOAA fisheries have jurisdiction over 165 endangered and threatened marine species, including 66 foreign species. Another government agency in the Department of the Interior is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has 70 national fish hatcheries, 7 technology centers, and 9 health centers. The Fish and Wildlife Service manages many fish habitats using the National Fish Passage Program, Fish and Wildlife Conservation Offices, and the National Fish Habitat Partnership and CITES Act. These programs work to conserve, restore, and enhance habitats using available fish and aquatic conservation tools. The Fish and Wildlife Service also manages for the existence and prevention of invasive species. The Fish and Wildlife Service also incorporates recreational and educational opportunities. The Marine Mammal Commission is an independent agency of the government under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The Commission uses scientific information to conduct specific reviews and studies and to formulate recommendations to other agencies, the administration, and Congress. The Michigan DNR, of course being a state-organized agency, is making scientific, research-based decisions on rearing and stockfish, regulations for fishing of the Great Lakes, inland lakes, and streams, and how to manage invasive species. Michigan's DNR operates 6 fish hatcheries, 5 permanent egg take stations, and up to 40 rearing ponds. The Great Lakes Fishery Commission works with federal and state governments to help manage the Great Lakes fisheries. Fishery management happens for each lake through lake committees, comprised of state, provincial, and U.S. tribal agencies with primary management jurisdiction on each lake, supported by federal agencies. Lake committees develop strategic fishery management goals for each lake, called fish community objectives. These objectives are of course used to benefit the Great Lakes and maintain them as a healthy ecosystem.
Some policies that affect fisheries and marine wildlife are the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the American Fisheries Act, and the Endangered Species Act of 1973. The Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act is known as MSA for short. It was first passed in 1976, and it is the primary law governing marine fisheries management in the U.S. federal waters. Its goal is to foster long-term biological and economic sustainability of our nation's marine fisheries. The MSA aims to prevent overfishing, rebuild overfished stocks, increase long-term economic and social benefits, and ensure a safe and sustainable supply of seafood. Congress passed the Marine Mammal Protection Act in 1972 in response to increasing concerns among scientists and the public that significant declines in some species of marine mammals were caused by human activities. The MMPA established a national policy to prevent marine mammal species and population stocks from declining beyond the point where they were no longer significant functioning elements of their ecosystems. This was the first legislation to mandate an ecosystem-based approach to marine resource management. There are 3 federal entities that share responsibility for implementing the MMPA. The first is the NOAA Fisheries, which is responsible for the protection of whales, dolphins, porpoises, seals, and the sea lions. The second is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is responsible for the protection of walrus, manatees, sea otters, and polar bears. And finally, the third is the Marine Mammal Commission, which provides independent, science-based oversight of policies, both domestic and international, and actions of federal agencies addressing human impacts on marine mammals and their ecosystems. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, enacted in 1969, requires federal agencies to integrate environmental values into their decision-making processes by considering the environmental impacts of their major proposed actions. Its primary goal is to foster better decision-making that takes into account all of the environmental impacts of an action, and it involves the public in that decision-making. The range of actions covered by NEPA is broad and includes making decisions on permit applications, adopting federal land management actions, constructing highways and other publicly owned facilities. Like we talked about in class, NEPA requires the agency to take a hard look into its plan or action. This requires them to go through a process that decides whether it has a significant impact on the environment or not. When NOAA Fisheries undertakes a federal action, the first thing they have to do is decide if the action is subject to the NEPA environmental review. A federal action is an activity such as a plan, project, or program which may be funded, regulated, conducted, or approved by a federal agency. If the action is subject to NEPA review, then the agency must document the environmental impacts at one of 3 levels of NEPA analysis. The first level is preparing a brief directive to the administrative record documenting that the activity qualifies for a categorical exclusion. The second level is preparing a concise environmental assessment and, if appropriate, a finding of no significant impact. And the third level is preparing a detailed environmental impact statement. Through this process, the well-being of marine wildlife and marine resources are looked after and needed mitigation is provided. The American Fisheries Act, also known as AFA, was signed into law in 1998. Its purpose was to tighten U.S. ownership standards and place restrictions on who could own fishing vessels of 100 feet or more. To be eligible for a mortgage, a person or company is required to be a U.S. citizen. The AFA also acts to provide the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands pollock fleet the opportunity to conduct their fishery in a more rational manner while protecting non-AFA participants and other fisheries. The AFA established sector allocations in the BSAI pollock fishery, determined eligible vessels and processors, allowed the formation of cooperatives, set limits on the participation of AFA vessels and other fisheries, and imposed special catch weighing and monitoring requirements on AFA vessels. Congress passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973, recognizing that the natural heritage of the United States was of aesthetic, ecological, educational, and scientific value to our nation and its people. It was understood that without protection, many of our nation's native plants and animals would become extinct. Under the ESA, the federal government has a responsibility to protect endangered species, threatened species, and critical habitats. An endangered species is a species that is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. A threatened species is a species that is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future, and a critical habitat is a specific area that is within the geographical area occupied by the species at the time of listing, if they contain physical or biological features essential to conservation, and those features may require special management, considerations, or protection. Or outside the geographical area occupied by the species if the agency determines that the area itself is essential for conservation.
Michigan state fish hatcheries have been around for decades, hatching eggs and rearing juvenile fish so they can be stocked in public water bodies throughout the state. Why does the Department of Natural Resources do this? For a variety of reasons. 1. To restore ecosystem balance, especially for fisheries affected by invasive species. 2. To provide diverse fishing opportunities folks of all ages can enjoy. 3. To rehabilitate fish populations that are below desired levels. And 4. To reintroduce species that have gone absent from Michigan.
Michigan's fish production system helps anglers with increasing angling opportunity by put, grow, and take efforts. And what that means is, here at the hatcheries, we're growing fish to put out in the wild, hoping that they will then grow, and so that anglers can take them either with catch and release or to bring them home for table fare. The hatcheries produce millions of fish annually for distribution all across the state. The value there has been estimated at anywhere from $5 to $11 billion annually. We've got 6 diverse fish hatcheries located all across the state. Each one has staff dedicated to those efforts.
2 of Michigan state fish hatcheries are in the Upper Peninsula, and the other 4 are located below the bridge. Each location puts a lot of time and care into rearing their respective species. Let's break it down. Harrietta State Fish Hatchery is Michigan's oldest facility of this kind, having opened in 1901. It's located in the northwest Lower Peninsula and rears rainbow and brown trout and Atlantic salmon. Marquette State Fish Hatchery is where the DNR rears brook and lake trout, as well as splake, a hybrid cross between these two species. Odin State Fish Hatchery is located near Petoskey and is the place where brown and rainbow trout are reared. Platte River State Fish Hatchery is just southwest of Traverse City and is Michigan's main salmon hatchery. They rear Atlantic, Chinook, and coho salmon here. Thompson State Fish Hatchery, located in Manistee, is where the DNR rears Chinook salmon, steelhead, and walleye. Lastly, Wolf Lake State Fish Hatchery in Mattawan currently produces steelhead, Chinook salmon, walleye, and Great Lakes muskellunge.
Our hatcheries have a lot to offer for visitors. They can see fish at different stages of development. It's very informative. There's a lot of information in our visitor centers. They could potentially come to a weir when we have adult salmon returning, or to other facilities that have show ponds where they can see adult fish.
Check out the DNR's fish rearing efforts up close and plan a visit to one or more of Michigan's state fish hatcheries. Learn all about the steps we take to safely and effectively rear more than 20 million fish to stock in Michigan waters each year. For more information, visit michigan.gov/hatcheries.
So I'm going to talk about the endangered and threatened species in the Great Lakes. There are about 61 fish species that are considered endangered or threatened. I listed some of the endangered species and threatened species of fish and mussel. Looking at the endangered species, I noticed a pattern of many of them were minnow-like fish that were endangered. And then in the threatened species, the Cisco, I only listed one species of Cisco, but there are like 5 of them at least that are threatened. And there was one that was extinct also. And most of these are listed within the state level. And there are very few listed federally. And you can find this if you go on the Fish and Wildlife Service. They have the ones that are listed federally. And then the other ones I got from the MSU website. It tells you if they're listed within the state or if they're listed federally also. One of the species I'm going to talk about is the lake sturgeon. This is a threatened species in Michigan, and it is popular as in there are many organizations working to recover the species, whether it's by funding, rearing, or restocking. The lake sturgeon can be found in rivers as well, not only just the lakes. These fish can get up to 7 foot long and 200 pounds, so they can get pretty big. And they have declined in population mainly because of overharvesting. They take many years to be able to spawn, so they just can't reproduce enough for how much they were harvested. You can still harvest this species, but there are very tight regulations on it. Like there's certain areas where you can fish for them and seasons. And when you harvest one, you can register it on the DNR website. And they have a lot of other information regarding the lake sturgeon that you can check out as well. Another species I'm going to talk about is an endangered species in Michigan, the black sandshell mussel. This species had a decline in population mainly because of their extreme sensitivity to copper and cadmium, which could come from pollutants like herbicide, pesticide, industrial waste, and mine drainage. Another thing that may have played a role in the population decline also could be alteration of their habitat and invasives entering the Great Lakes and outcompeting them. So this species is surveyed using glass bottom buckets and scuba diving, and that's how they survey and get their numbers for the species.
There are many threats to species in the Great Lakes, such as pollution, climate change, invasive species, and sulfide mining. Pollution could be caused from past and present pollutants like industrial waste, raw sewage overflows, runoff from cities such as fertilizers or sediment from erosion, and finally trash and litter accumulating in the lakes. Climate change causes increasing temperatures of air and water in the Great Lakes region and can cause poor water quality, which causes stress in the water and in the fish populations. Invasive species compete with the native species for food and habitat. This leads native species to being endangered or even extinct. Some examples are shown in the picture, such as the guaga mussels, Asian carp, zebra mussels, sea lampreys, round gobies, and more. Sulfide mining can destroy fish habitats and poison the water, which creates bad water quality for the fish. Another one that's not on the slide is overfishing. That's kind of obvious. If you fish too much and take away too many of the fish, then they can't reproduce properly and sustain their population. Because there are so many ways that humans can negatively impact or endanger the species in the Great Lakes, it's important to make sure that we properly manage our natural resources in a sustainable and ecologically safe manner. One specific threat to the fish in the Great Lakes is the algal blooms in Lake Erie. Algal blooms are a condensed population of algae due to runoff pollution and warmer water temperatures from global warming. These conditions create a perfect environment for the survival of this toxic cyanobacteria. Algal blooms harm fish populations by toxins directly killing fish and shellfish, or depleting oxygen from the water, which in turn suffocates the fish. Not only does it harm fish, but it can be a skin irritant for people, and when a person eats the fish that has ingested the toxins, it can release toxins in humans as well. This negatively impacts the fishing industry in Lake Erie. Sea lampreys are another example of threats to fish in the Great Lakes. Originally native to the Atlantic Ocean, sea lampreys came into the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway and were found in Lake Erie in 1921 and into Lake Superior by 1938. In the ocean, sea lampreys can coexist with other marine species in the ecosystem. However, these fish are parasites to most fish in the Great Lakes, including trout, lake sturgeon, ciscos, salmon, and more. Sea lampreys are bloodsuckers, so they attach to the fish with their teeth and cut through the scales with their sharp tongue. And then they suck the bodily fluids out of the fish by secreting an enzyme similar to the enzyme that leeches produce, which prevents the blood from clotting. Before sea lampreys made it into the Great Lakes, U.S. and Canadian fisheries harvested around 15 million pounds of lake trout each year. By the 1960s, harvests were only around 300,000 pounds. This significantly impacted not only the fish populations, but the rest of the Great Lakes ecosystems as well as the economy. The Sea Lamprey Control Program was set in place to reduce the population of sea lampreys in the Great Lakes with the use of lampricides, barriers to block adults from getting to spawning sites, and traps for catching the adults that got through barriers. These methods have been effective in reducing the sea lamprey population by 90% in the Great Lakes.